Hiya! Today we're talking about a text that is very apt for the travel metaphor we've got going on with this podcast, and that is the Odyssey. It's probably the most famous of travel narratives, but how much do we really know about it, and what does it actually tell us? Welcome aboard the International Express to Book Central. Grab a seat, settle in, and let's while away the journey with some book chat. I'm your host, Jules, and thank you for joining me once again. And also thank you for those of you who watched the video last week. I was very surprised, in a good way, that people were once again listening. So yay! That is, of course, exciting to know that my thoughts are reaching an audience. And as always, if you disagree with me, or if there's anything you want to hear, do let me know. I'm also still re-familiarizing myself with all of this recording, so I do apologize if some things are a bit choppy or don't fully work yet. I'm working on it, I promise. But today we're talking about the Odyssey by Homer, ? We're going to get into Homer. That's going to be one of the first things that we'll do. We'll talk a little bit about the text itself, what we know about it, what we know about oral formulaic poetry that is now written down, and then we're going to very excessively get into each of the 24 books that make up the Odyssey. I took a lot of notes, and hopefully I can present it to you in a manner that is somewhat straightforward and to the point. I'm not going to get into each and every single detail, but my thought behind this is that one, I just read the Odyssey with my book club. We started it a while back, sort of in excitement for the film, but also just generally because we enjoy reading classics together. So that is the main reason, or the first reason, why I wanted to talk about it on this podcast. But then, of course, as I've already mentioned, there is a big film coming out. And I remember when the first teaser dropped, there was this online debate of what is the Odyssey? Why am I expected to know about the Odyssey? What do you mean classic of Western literature? I was never taught this in school. And I realized that while I might have been #blessed with an upbringing in which a lot of these classics were introduced to me in various ways, be it through children's literature, sort of abridged, adapted versions, or eventually having lessons in Latin and Greek at school, I'm familiar with these texts, but I appreciate not everyone is, and they can be quite intimidating to get into, mainly because they are such big classics. And are you meant to understand them, follow them? Are you meant to enjoy them? Or are you purely meant to be inspired by the grand words of grand poets? So I thought I'm going to give you a breakdown of it, just in case you don't have time to read it yourself before you go to see it in the cinema, or in case you want to be able to go see it in the cinema and have some thoughts about how it fits with the poem, but you're not entirely sure about reading it yourself. I'm going to break down the books for you so that you're familiar with the most important figures, with some of the mythical poetic background, and so you have an idea of what the story is like in most translations. So that's what we're going to do. And then at the end, I'm going to have a little bit of a anticipation section, like things I'm excited about seeing in the film. I have to admit, I haven't seen any of the trailers yet. I'm keeping myself very pure, but I have seen the Vanity Fair shoot with the actresses playing Penelope, Helen/Clytemnestra, Circe, and of course Athena, and I'm very excited about that. We're not even going to get into the debate about whether Lupita Nyong'o is perfect for Helen, because she is, and on top of that, she's also perfect for Clytemnestra. I don't know who of you have seen Jordan Peele's Us, but she can do scary, and she's gorgeous. So, okay, let's just get into it. I will be giving you a bit of an introduction, and in that I'm going to base myself almost entirely on my own thoughts, but also on the introduction Emily Wilson wrote for her own translation of the Odyssey, which is also the one that I've read. I've read a couple of different translations of the Odyssey just during school and studies, and I've unfortunately also had to translate parts of the Odyssey, which did not go well. I wasn't very good at ancient Greek. But I have thoughts, but there are some things that are worth knowing if you want to have something of a critical approach, maybe, to the Odyssey. So, first thing to know is that it's an old text. It was written circa 3,000 years ago. It's old. It's very old. And of course, as is true with any old text, scholars cannot entirely agree on a precise date of creation, even a date of writing down, let alone a date when it was first told. We have the same thing with medieval literature, and medieval literature is a lot younger than ancient Greek literature. So what Emily Wilson writes in her introduction is that most scholars, most classicists, agree on a date somewhere between the late 8th and the late 7th century BC. That gives us about a 100-year period in which scholars believe things might have started happening in relation to the Odyssey. Now, it is an epic. Epic means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And what I like is that Emily Wilson kind of breaks it down by looking at the actual Greek word from which epic comes, which is epos, and that just means word, story, song. In this case, the Odyssey is an epic because it is a story. It is a song that is being sung, a story that is being told. That is what we're just going to stick with, and then maybe we'll have more thoughts about what is epic about it later. It is a traditional epic from antiquity, which means that it contains a lot of formulaic language. It has over 12,000 lines, and it's written in dactylic hexameter, which means it's got 6 beats. Emily Wilson does mention that as she was going about translating it, she wanted to be able to retain that sort of poetic atmosphere. So while a lot of translators move to free verse or even to prose, she decided to use iambic pentameter because that is the most really recognizable meter in the English language, I would say. It's what Shakespeare uses, da-dum, 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 you know, that one. Now, Emily Wilson is our translator for the translation that I've read, but alongside her name, there is the name Homer on the cover. And Homer is on every single cover of the Odyssey and, of course, also the Iliad. So how much do we really know about Homer? I know that there's a lot of conversations already about authors, playwrights like Shakespeare. We know Shakespeare was a real person. We know when he lived. We have all this information about what his education was like, what his life was like, when which things were written. And even there we have debates. Well, some people have debates. I'm not on that side. But people have debates about whether Shakespeare is really the playwright behind Romeo and Juliet, etc., right? So imagine if we go back an extra almost like 2,000 years, and then we have to figure out if a person called Homer actually wrote something, and then already we run into the issue of, well, wrote? Is Homer the person who wrote the things down, or is he the original poet who composed it, who performed it? Was he himself literate? Was he a she? Were they a they? We don't know these things about Homer. We don't have a birth certificate for this man. And this issue is referred to in sort of classical studies as the Homeric question, capital H, capital Q. Emily Wilson kind of breaks down the different aspects of this question, of the debate around it. And I think one of the most important things to sort of know now from all of that academic history is that in the 19th century, there were 2 different schools that basically summarized some of the previous thinking about it. And that was the Unitarian school and the Analytic school. Now, the Unitarian school, as the name might suggest, they believed strongly that there was one author, Homer, behind the Odyssey, and that there was a single text that was right, that was good, and they just needed to get back to that somehow. Whereas the Analytic school, which is much more in line, I think, with a lot of modern thinking when it comes to medieval and ancient texts, believed that there had been various authors, performers, scribes, and that they together created a text that is therefore almost polyphonic. It has multiple voices, is what that means. And I personally would align with that as well. Another important thing to know about sort of the scholarship and the history around both Homer and his 2 biggest texts, the Odyssey and the Iliad, is that in the 1930s, there was an important man called Milman Parry. He went to what is then Yugoslavia, and he observed, worked with bards there, Serbo-Croatic bards, and they would perform epics, poems, songs for him. And he began to theorize about how oral poetry works. He unfortunately died very young, and his apprentice, Albert Lord, then took over afterwards. Second World War had to come in between, and then in the 1960s, he published on their work. And from that, we get the Parry-Lord hypothesis about oral poetry. The main important thing to know about oral poetry is that it's formulaic. And this is why sometimes ancient, but also medieval poetry and text can feel quite repetitive and boring to modern readers, because we're used to things moving on. Things may be getting repeated once or twice if they're really important, but we don't want people to constantly be referred to in the same way, to constantly have similar kind of scenes. When you have to remember and then perform such texts, if you have to hear them, these oral poems, and then store them in your memory and then perform them at a different occasion for a different kind of audience that might want to hear a slightly different version of it, it's very useful if you have certain formulae. If you know, okay, when they wake up, I'm going to refer to the rosy-fingered dawn, which arrives early, which is something you will see nonstop in both the Iliad and the Odyssey. I know that Odysseus is always wily, and I know that Telemachus, his son, he's earnest, and Penelope is always sad, so I can call her the sad lady or something like that, right? And that gives poets the time to then, in real time, craft their poem and their performance, because these little formulae provide them mental cognitive space to come up with the next bit. So that's very important, but it can be difficult for modern readers to get into and to not consider it a flaw. Now, with all of that, the question of Homer, to what extent Homer is just a name that we now give to the countless people who performed this text, this story across centuries, nay millennia. What we do know and what we can say is that the Odyssey is now a written text based on oral tradition. The big tragedy of oral storytelling is that it's gone the moment the performance is over, right? Unless you record it, which we are now able to do and have been able to do for a couple of decades, you cannot retain an oral performance. So we don't know how Beowulf, how Eddic poetry, how the Odyssey was performed 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago in some cases, right? So what we have now is a written text that we can see retains elements of oral storytelling. As Emily Wilson puts it, the Odyssey as we have it is a patchwork. There are different dialects in there are inconsistencies, and we just have to work through that. We have to work with the text and enjoy it as it is. People have been engaging with the Odyssey for a very long time. Something I really liked finding out about the Odyssey in Emily Wilson's introduction is that there were already Homeric scholars in the 2nd century BCE in the Library of Alexandria. They were already collecting different versions of the tale and creating editions of it. And there would be poets performing these texts, specifically also the Odyssey and the Iliad, of course. One big element of that was what was called the Panathenaea in 566 BCE in Athens, which was a sort of festival put on by the tyrant at the time, Pisistratus. And there we would have poets being asked to perform correctly, regardless of what correctly means, the Odyssey or the Iliad. And of course, always parts of it. There's no single poet who can get through over 12,000 lines in a single performance. We also know that Homer was a thing, that the texts, so the Odyssey and the Iliad, were linked to him because, for example, we see quotations from Homer in the works of Plato. Now, Plato, in his The Republic, he's very against poets because he feels like poets are, they have a very good way with words, but because of that, they're not truthful and honest. And I don't really like Plato, so I'll put his opinion on Homer aside. Now, with that, we perhaps have a little bit of an understanding of how complex of a text, and whenever I say text, I mean it as something that we can read. Not just read with our eyes, but that we can think about, that we can puzzle with. A film can be a text, a song can be a text in that sense. So with the Odyssey, we have a text that was composed, performed, written down centuries, millennia ago. And it is a text that has always been in movement. Now, it is important to know that Homer and his works were lost to Western Europe for a bit. So if it was first composed and written down somewhere in the late 8th and late 7th century BCE, then of course at a certain point it made it to Alexandria and it moved through all of these different countries. There's a lot of evidence of people knowing about these texts as far as I'm aware. But especially with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, there came something of a point where people no longer read ancient Greek, they no longer had manuscripts of these texts, and so it was sort of lost a little bit. But again, with our thanks to the Middle East in the Middle Ages, they preserved Homer in various Arabic translations, And once the Byzantine Empire, so the Eastern Roman Empire, you could say, once that collapsed, the refugees brought these manuscripts back into Europe in the mid sort of 15th century. The first translation into English was made in 1613, I believe, by George Chapman. And since then, it's sort of very actively been part of the school curriculum in many countries. It used to be part of the school curriculum in the Roman Empire, and it's still part of the curriculum in many countries to this day, regardless of in what form. It might, like me, if you have ancient Greek at school and you have to take that class in order to get to university, you will encounter it there. Otherwise, you might encounter it in an English class when we talk about James Joyce's Ulysses, or if we're talking about any of the sort of traditions of European literature. Homer, the Odyssey, the Iliad, they will come up. So that gives us a not short overview of some of the things that might be interesting to know about the Odyssey. And we're going to move on from there to a discussion of the story itself. And so, like I said, the Odyssey has 24 books / chapters. They're usually called books, but they function like chapters. And I'm going to run you through all of them. And there's going to be a couple of things that are interesting to bear in mind. One of them is the idea of a hero. Nowadays, we like to think of a hero as someone who is morally good. They are a virtuous person, they strive for the good of others, they are self-sacrificing, etc. But that is quite a modern idea of heroism. Now, the word hero also comes from ancient Greek, as a lot of words do, heros. And that means more something just like warrior than our modern understanding of hero. And I recently sort of thought about this myself in the context of medieval literature. There is a scholar, Klaus von See, and he wrote about the exorbitancy of heroism that we see in the Middle Ages. And I think this aligns somewhat nicely with figures like Odysseus as well. We want a hero to be, again, self-sacrificing, working for the greater good, full of morals, full of virtues. That's sort of the ideal idea of a hero. But in a lot of medieval texts, we will actually see heroic characters who are just exorbitant, hence why he calls it that. They are incredibly strong. They are incredibly driven by their own interests. They will always pursue what they want for themselves. They are not at work for a society, for a group of people. Sigurd doesn't go slay the dragon because it's bothering other people or is a pest to society. No, he slays it because he wants the treasure and because he will gain honor and because he promised his foster father. And the same is true when we look at a character like Odysseus. He is our protagonist in many ways, but then also, well, he shares that role a little bit with his son. But he is definitely our main focus. He's the main character. And he is a hero in the sense that he fights. He struggles, he strives, he is in endless pursuit of his own goals. That does not make him a virtuous, good man. I think Emily Wilson nails that in her translation to allow us to see how fascinating Odysseus is. He's so smart, he's so clever, and because of that he's so tricksy, and he would thrive in the modern day obsession with the anti-hero, right? But he is also deeply flawed. He makes mistakes that lead to the deaths of a number of men. He is violent, he is angry, he doesn't trust people, etc. So it gives us a really complex portrait of what a hero might be. So that's something to bear in mind. Something also to know about ancient Greek literature, but also probably just culture in general. For ancient Greece, we have this idea of Xenia, which is hospitality or guest friendship. You never know who might come visit. It might be a god, and therefore you should always welcome guests in a friendly manner. You should be respectful of strangers who come to your house for help, right? And Odysseus, because he's on a journey, is an endless guest. And this is not something that just ancient Greek literature does. Old Norse literature is full of guests, for example, as well. One of the nicknames for Odin, the god, is literally Gestur, because he is a consistent guest and you better be nice. So there's this idea of hospitality. How do we treat people who enter into our home? Okay, with those things in mind, let's maybe just dive straight into the text. As always, I'm going to give you some of the opening lines. So here we start, Book 1 of the Odyssey, titled The Boy and the Goddess in Emily Wilson's translation. Tell me about a complicated man. Muse, tell me how he wandered and was lost when he had wrecked the holy town of Troy, and where he went and who he met, the pain he suffered on the sea, and how he worked to save his life and bring his men back home. He failed, and for their own mistakes they died. They ate the sun god's cattle, and the god kept them from home. Now, goddess, child of Zeus, tell the old story for our modern times. Find the beginning. And so begins the Odyssey. And we are told, very briefly, that Odysseus is currently with the goddess Calypso on her island. And then we quickly move on to the gods who are feasting. Poseidon is currently elsewhere, but the gods are together, and Zeus is thinking of Aegisthus. Now, for those who don't know who Aegisthus is, we're going to encounter that story a number of times throughout the Odyssey. But the great leader of the Greek army, Agamemnon, brother of Menelaus, brother-in-law to Helen, when he returned home from the Trojan War, it turned out that Aegisthus had sort of taken over his kingdom and his position, and had even gone so far as convincing Agamemnon's wife, Clytemnestra, sister of Helen, to join him in that mini coup. And depending on what version you read, either Clytemnestra kills her husband Agamemnon or Aegisthus does. And there is a whole tragedy about this in the sense that there's multiple plays called the Oresteia. And it's called the Oresteia because Agamemnon has a son, Orestes. And Orestes takes vengeance for the death of his father Agamemnon, potentially by killing his mother Clytemnestra, and he's then hunted by the Furies for this. So what we have there from the very beginning of the Odyssey, when we haven't even gotten into whatever is going on with Odysseus yet, we have this story material in the background about a father, a husband returning home, being betrayed by his wife, murdered in a bathtub, I might add, and then having a young son who has to take on revenge and is hunted to the ends of the earth for it. So that's on Zeus's mind, but he gets interrupted by his favorite daughter, the goddess Athena, who's like, how can you be thinking about other things when Odysseus is stuck on an island? Can we not maybe finally let that man get off this island? Zeus is like, I have not forgotten. I never forget. And so Athena gets permission to get involved, and she's so excited. She disguises herself like a man called Mentor. And yes, that's where we get the word mentor from. And instead of going to Odysseus, who's on an island, she goes to Ithaca. And that is where Odysseus' palace is, where his wife Penelope waits, and where his son Telemachus is now almost all grown up. Telemachus was only a baby when Odysseus left, but he's now about 20 years old. And when Athena, disguised as Mentor, comes into the palace, she meets Telemachus there. And he is, bless his heart, he brings this guest in. He's nice to this guest. We have a lot of Xenia friendship going on here, until he explains what is going on in Ithaca, and that Penelope is surrounded by suitors who all want to marry her because Odysseus has been gone for 20 years, so surely she's dead, and if she could just marry someone, then we would all be done. And they're basically eating Telemachus and Penelope out of stock and house. Like, they're endlessly feasting, having all the pigs slaughtered and everything. And Athena is like, well, you can't just let that happen. This is your father's house, surely. And Telemachus is like, oh, woe is me, my father is undoubtedly dead, and I am but a young boy. And Athena, in disguise, assures him that surely Odysseus will return, and maybe Telemachus could go on a little bit of a journey himself to find out more about his father, visit some of his father's friends from the Trojan War. And Telemachus is like, no, that sounds like a great idea. This could be a real journey of growth for me. Athena disappears. Penelope appears, Telemachus' mother, Odysseus' wife, and she appears in order to ask a poet who has been performing for the suitors to please stop singing his song, because he is singing about the Trojan War and all the men who died, and it's making her quite sad because she thinks one of those men who died might be her husband. Telemachus is rude to his mother, basically tells her, like, shut up, go upstairs, I'm the man of the house, and you have to read Telemachus with a lot of goodwill. Or not. You can also dislike Telemachus for how he treats his mother. But he's sort of trying to establish himself as the man of the house, right? So he tells his mother to go back upstairs, and then he tries to tell the suitors off, and they're basically all his age, a little older maybe, but they basically make fun of him. And they're like, okay, little boy, sure. And one of the main suitors that we need to know about is called Antinous. Antinous? There's going to be varying pronunciations probably. He is very rude, and he sort of set himself up as the leader of the suitors. So now we've met a number of our key characters here, although you'll note that we haven't really met Odysseus yet. But book 2 begins with Telemachus going to a meeting the next day with all the important people in Ithaca, and he's like, the suitors are in my house and everything sucks and none of you help me, and then he cries a little bit. And Antinous, the leader of the suitors, is there, and he explains to him like, yeah, sure, we're being annoying, but also your mother isn't helping. And he tells us the story of how Penelope said, okay, I appreciate all you suitors are here. I will make a decision once I've finished this shroud for Laertes, who's Odysseus' father. She's like, it would be shameful of me to not weave a shroud for my father-in-law. Once I've finished it, then I will make a decision. So every day the suitors are watching her weave, and every night, without them knowing it, she is undoing her weaving so that it takes her years. And at a certain point, the suitors find out and they force her to finish it, and now we're sort of at this stalemate. Telemachus says, I cannot make my mother marry against her will. That's not a thing I can do. At that point, Zeus sends by some eagles. And there's a number of times where we see these kind of omens, which are always sort of affirming like something will be happening. The gods are paying attention. So Telemachus now states that he's going to go on a journey. Everyone gets very excited. Penelope is not allowed to know. And Mentor/Mentees, now actually as the person himself, says that he will go with him. And at that moment, Athena then reappears and takes on the disguise of Mentor. And she basically sets up this entire journey. She makes sure the boat is ready, etc. Telemachus, meanwhile, is still getting mocked by the suitors. But at least there's one person in Telemachus' corner, aside from Athena, and that is his old nurse, Eurycleia. She's a slave woman. She used to be the nurse of Odysseus himself, and now she's basically helped raise Telemachus as well. He lets her in on his journey plan, but again, he makes her promise not to tell his mother. So, Athena's gotten the ship ready, Telemachus is ready, off they go. In book 3, Telemachus first arrives in Pylos, where Nestor lives, and if you've read the Iliad, then you know that Nestor was also in the Trojan War, and so Odysseus was one of his friends. Now, he doesn't initially know that it's Telemachus, Odysseus' son, who's arrived, but because of guest friendship, they organize a little bit of a meal, then they do a toast to the goddess Pallas Athena, and in a delightful bit of humor, in my opinion at least, Athena in disguise is the one who does the toast. And she's sort of like, here is to the goddess Athena, which is me, ha ha ha. Eventually, Telemachus then does ask after his father, and Nestor tells us something more of the Trojan War. He explains how bitter their journey home was. They did quite a bit to annoy the gods when they sacked Troy. One of the things there is the rape of Cassandra, who's a daughter of Priam, the king of Troy. They did that in a temple dedicated to Athena, and so Athena was mad, and she actually ensured that all of their ships was scattered by a storm. So he's not entirely sure where Odysseus might be, but Nestor does tell Telemachus the story of Aegisthus and Clytemnestra and Agamemnon and Orestes. So we again have this material come up. So they have a meal, then they have a bit of a sacrifice the next day to the gods, and then Telemachus heads off to visit more companions of his father's, but this time he's accompanied by one of the sons of Nestor called Pisistratus. So at least he has a buddy now. With that, we hit book 4, and now he is in Sparta, which is of course the home of Menelaus and Helen. They have a feast. Because their daughter Hermione is just sent off to go marry the son of Achilles. So they're having a party, and once again Telemachus, alongside his friend Pisistratus, haven't revealed their own identities yet, but as guests, of course, they can be a part of it. And Telemachus is super impressed with Sparta, and it's very cute. It's sort of like this young boy who's off his island for the first time, and he's like, this is an amazing hall. This is an amazing palace. Everything is great. I'm very overwhelmed. He gets into a conversation with Menelaus, and Menelaus tells him about his own journey home. And what is really touching about this is that Menelaus really talks about his own sorrow and his regret about the Trojan War, how many good men died and how he misses them. And now he sits alone in his splendid palace, and his drinking buddies, his friends, his comrades are gone, and of course his brother is dead. And at this, Telemachus has to cry a little bit, and he tries to hide his face with his mantle, but of course they see. And at this point, Helen comes in. And what is important to know, both about the Iliad and the Odyssey, is that the image we have of Helen in popular culture doesn't fully align with what is mentioned in the texts. We like to think of her as this beautiful woman who just maybe ran off with another man and caused this endless war. But within these stories, Helen is not just a victim. I don't want to fully take away her agency, but she is a woman who is under duress. The gods have decided that she would be Paris's gift, and so now that is what is going to happen. She has no say in the Trojan War. She also can't end it on her own, right? So she's now come back to Sparta, and she's sort of regained her position there. And it's worth mentioning, she talks about her own face, which she calls dog-like, and how her face hounded people into war. And here it's worth mentioning that the sentence that we know, the face that launched 1,000 ships, that's from Christopher Marlowe. It's not in the Odyssey. It's not in the Iliad. Okay? So she's gorgeous, she's beautiful, but within the Odyssey, she actually gets some time to say that she didn't want any of this, and that it really shouldn't be considered to be her fault. At this point, Telemachus and his friend introduce themselves, and Menelaus is like, oh my god, I don't know anything about Odysseus, but it's beautiful to see that he has such a strapping son. But everyone's very sad. So Helen creates this mixture of wine and some herbs to make people forget their sorrows. And she tells a story about Odysseus, who one day snuck into her chambers in Troy. And it's actually quite nice that she is the one to have this memory that she can share with Telemachus before they all fall asleep. The next day, Telemachus tells Menelaus about the horrible situation back in Ithaca, all these suitors, so there's nothing really that he can do. And this makes Menelaus launch into an endless story, which is really weird, about his own return and how difficult it was. They got stuck on an island, and then they had to trap a sea god called Proteus, and there were seals involved somehow. Anyway, he also talks about his brother Agamemnon's death once again, and then we are told that Odysseus is with the goddess nymph Calypso. We then have a little bit of a shift of scenery, and we hop back to Ithaca, where all the suitors are gathered, and they're like, so Telemachus is a bit of a pain in our backside, because we're trying to marry his mother, and he doesn't seem to be happy about it, so how about we try and kill him? And as they're plotting this, Penelope realizes her son is gone, that he has gone on a journey, and she's really sad. Penelope is consistently sad throughout the Odyssey, and she's so sad that Athena actually gives her a dream in which she gives her a little bit of comfort, and so her face wet with tears, but hopefully a little bit more at ease, Penelope gets to go to sleep. With that, we move to book 5, and Athena is once again asking Zeus, now that I've started meddling and preparing the scene, can we let Odysseus go? He's on this island called Ogygia, and he's with Calypso, and Calypso will not let him go. He sits on the beach the whole day just crying, let this man go. And Zeus is like, yes. So he sends Hermes to Calypso to basically be like, let this man go. You cannot keep him against his will. And Calypso, quite fairly, is annoyed at this hypocrisy. She's like, all of you male gods constantly go about grabbing young women, and now I have this man, who may I say, washed up on my island, like an absolute Wilson volleyball, and I've made him happy, I've given him everything he wants, but okay, if it's the command from the gods, then I will let him go, even though he's been with me for 7 years. Odysseus has been on this island forever. So she goes and talks to Odysseus, and she's like, I am gorgeous, I'm a goddess, I could basically make you immortal, my island is a paradise, do you still want to go home? And Odysseus is like, yes, I miss my wife. I miss my own miserable little island. And I miss my son. She helps him build a raft. We get a lot of detail about how this raft is built. He heads out onto sea and Poseidon wrecks him. The moment Poseidon realizes that Odysseus is back on the water, he makes sure that that raft does not survive long. And we will find out later why exactly Poseidon is so pissed at him. But as Odysseus is floating in the sea, once again miserable, the goddess Ino, she decides to help him, and Odysseus reaches Phaeacia. I think that's how you pronounce it. And there, book 6 starts because Phaeacia has a princess called Nausicaa, and she is a young woman, let's say. She's sort of maturing into her womanhood. Marriage is on the horizon for her, but not quite yet. But she's beloved by her parents, beloved by her playmates, and Athena appears to her in a dream, and she's like, girl, if you're almost ready to get married, you should really be doing some laundry. Why don't you go to the river tomorrow? And so Nausicaa does. She gets her friends together and some of her female slaves as well. They head off to the river where, of course, Odysseus is. They find him. He looks horrible because, he's been at sea for days and then he slept in the bushes somewhere. But Nausicaa is a brave girl and she's like, this man and there must be a reason, okay? And here Athena, for the first time, makes Odysseus into something slightly different. She makes him incredibly attractive. Once he's sort of dipped into the water and washed some of the grime off of him, she just pours handsomeness all over him. And then the rest of the women are also like, okay, we'll take this man home. And they sort of have to come up with a little bit of a ruse to get him home. Nausicaa can't just go to a river, pick up a man and take him home. So they come up with a little bit of a plot, with Athena's help, of course. So in book 7, we see Athena create something of a bit of a mist so that no one can see Odysseus. She makes him somewhat invisible until he arrives at the palace where Nausicaa's parents, Queen Arete and King Alcinous, live. They agree to help him. It's pretty straightforward, but there's a bit of background history on these characters, which is very interesting. They are willing to help him, but they do want to know a little bit more about him. So Odysseus, without telling them his name and who he really is, tells them about Calypso, how he's just washed up here, how the princess helped him, and then he gets to go to sleep. In book 8, we are still with the Phaeacians, and we have a feast. At this feast, we also have a poet, Demodocus. He's not started playing yet, because if you have a good feast, then first you need to have some games. And so all the eligible young bachelors are showing off. And of course, Odysseus is showing off even more. Even though he was just, lost at sea 2 days ago, he is now kicking everyone's ass at sports. And then they all sit down, and the poet Demodocus begins to sing songs, tell stories. And one of the first stories that he tells is that of Eris and Aphrodite's affair. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on that just because it is a fun story. Aphrodite, the goddess of love, was married to the god Hephaestus, who was the god of smithing, of crafting, and he notably had a bad leg, which means that he limped. Now, Aphrodite was also very much in lust/love with the god Ares, who's the god of war. And so while Hephaestus was off building things, they were having an affair. And Hephaestus finds out about this, and he crafts this net, which he hangs over their marriage bed. And so the next time that Ares and Aphrodite are having their fun, the net drops. And because Hephaestus is a god, they cannot get out from under this net. And he calls all the other gods together and he's like, look at my wife betraying me. Look at Ares just cuckolding me. We cannot be doing this. And all the gods are like, well, it's sort of funny though, isn't it? And it sort of ends with that. That's also quite an interesting story to come up here because one of Odysseus's big concerns is that after him being gone for basically 20 years, that his wife is no longer faithful to him. So we have this in the background. Now, after this, Odysseus asks our poet to actually sing the story of the famous Trojan horse. And while he does that, Odysseus starts crying and he tries to cover his face with his mantle, with his cloak, but the king Alcinous sees. And book 8 ends with him asking this stranger, "Why are you crying?" Okay. Then from book 9, we're going to get a delightful flashback because when you're asked why you cry, then you have to explain everything that's ever happened to you in your entire life, as we all know. So Odysseus, who's here called the Lord of Lies in Emily Wilson's translation, starts by praising the poet who has just sung, and then he begins to tell of his journey home. So we now jump back in time a good, 10 years really. After he left Troy, after they did their sacking and burning of the city, he decided to sack another town. Then they dropped by a people called the Cyclones, I believe. Some of his men died there because they were giants trying to eat people. Then they dropped by the Lotus Eaters, which is a group of people who eat lotuses. And once you've eaten them, you don't really care for anything. So some of his men ate lotuses, and therefore he lost some of his men there as well. After that, they had more bad luck because they arrived at an island where Cyclopes live. And there we get the famous story of the Cyclops Polyphemus and his encounter with Odysseus. They find a cave, Odysseus and his men, once they get to this island, and they go in, and then suddenly they realize, this is a giant's cave. And then a giant comes home with his herd of sheep, and they're locked in the cave with him because he rolls a big stone in front of it, and they cannot roll it back themselves. He then realizes he has guests, and he eats some of Odysseus' men, and Odysseus is like, well, that's not good. So the next day, they come up with this plan, and they sharpen a stick, and they poke it into Polyphemus's one eye. And now blinded, he can no longer see these intruders. And it's just him in this cave with his sheep, and somewhere these people who just blinded him. So the next day, he rolls back the stone from his cave, Polyphemus does, and he touches each of the sheep as it leaves his cave. And Odysseus, because he is smart, has his people hide underneath the sheep, and that way they can escape. But while Odysseus is smart, he's also very dumb, because earlier he had introduced himself as no man or no one. So now Polyphemus is running around being like, no one stabbed me, no one hurt me. But Odysseus, as they sail away, even though his men literally ask him to stop antagonizing the Cyclops, is like, make sure you tell everyone that it was Odysseus of Ithaca who stabbed out your eye. What Odysseus forgot in this moment is that this Cyclops, Polyphemus, is a son of Poseidon. So, of course, he begs his father, Poseidon, to avenge him. And Poseidon does. And Poseidon hates Odysseus from this moment forward. And so they're basically lost at sea. And Book 10 begins with Odysseus continuing to tell us his story. They were adrift on the sea, and then they rocked up in a place where Aeolus lives, who's somewhat of a god of the wind. And initially all is good, they are welcomed, and Aeolus gives him a literal wind bag, a bag that contains the winds. Except Odysseus doesn't tell his people about this, and so when they head off and they sort of reach a lull in the wind and Odysseus has a bit of a nap, his men open this bag, and they were already almost in sight of Ithaca, basically. But because they've now released the winds out of this bag, they're once again lost at sea. They rock back up at Aeolus' place, and he's like, no, I already helped you. You're the worst. Leave me. Next, they're with the Lystrigonians. More people die. They get eaten. Everything is very miserable. So the next island they get to is Aiaia. And this is where the goddess Circe lives, who's also a witch. Odysseus sends some of his men off. They're all like, okay, so the Lystrigonians were bad. Some of us got eaten, so we have to be careful. So he sends some of his men off. They find this beautiful house where there is this beautiful woman called Circe, and she invites them to eat. And then she just happens to wave a wand, and these men turn into pigs. And one of them manages to escape, and he runs back, and he's like, we've been turned into pigs. We are doomed. We have to leave. And Odysseus is like, no, I can't actually let some of my men remain forever in pig form. So he sets off. And before he reaches Circe's house himself, Hermes, the god, shows up, and he's like, okay, here's what you need to do so that you can get through this and so that she can help you actually get home. And so when he gets there, he refuses to eat any food, and he pulls out his sword and he intimidates her, and then they sleep together, and then she turns his men back, and they stay there for an entire year. I imagine maybe they need to recover. It's been a lot, admittedly. But after a year, his men are like, Odysseus, can we go home? And he's like, yeah, I've also been trying to get home, actually. And he is told that in order to go home, he first needs to go to the underworld. So, in Book 11, we go to the underworld. And I adored this book. It's just really exciting. They go on this little journey. And When they're there, they go through the ritual of what to do, how to sort of make a sacrifice, and then the blood will call the spirits of the dead. And the first spirit that shows up, bless his heart, is Elpenor, which is one of Odysseus's own men. He was drunk, and so he was sleeping on the roof, as you do. And when Odysseus had sort of called out that they were going now to go to the underworld, Elpenor fell off the roof and died. So he's still lying there because they hadn't realized, or they didn't know where he was and they just left. So he's like, can you please give me a proper burial? And Odysseus is like, yes, I will. Then the next ghost that shows up is his mother, Anticlea, but he can't let her close to the blood. He can't actually speak to her because who he's waiting for is Tiresias. And that is a very famous prophet, or seer, in Greek mythology. He pops up in quite a couple of stories. And Tiresias is like, okay, cool. You will absolutely get home, because that's why they went to the underworld, to find out if they can actually get home. But there's one thing. You need to be really careful when you get to the sun god's island that you do not eat his cows. And secondly, you may get home, but you cannot settle at home until you get to a land carrying an oar where someone will think that the oar is a winnowing fan. Okay, bye. And then Tiresias leaves. And this is like, okay, what am I going to do with this? Then his mother's spirit comes back, Anticlea, and he keeps talking to her. And he's like, is everyone at home okay? And she's like, well, I'm dead, so no. And after her, a whole bunch of other women from mythology show up. The sort of wives and daughters of kings who are related to other myths. And they were apparently sent by the dread goddess Persephone. And I just like that, seeing that. But that's not the end. As he's about to tell what other spirits he saw there, we get a brief interruption, and we're suddenly reminded that Odysseus is telling this story to a rapt audience. And they're all like, this is absolutely fascinating, the things that you've experienced. So we go back to the story he's telling. He sees Agamemnon, who is really upset that he's dead. That he got murdered by his wife, Clytemnestra / by Aegisthus. He's like, you can't trust women. I mean, Penelope is a good woman, but still, you gotta get home because you cannot trust these women. He's very mad. We get to see more heroes from the Iliad. Achilles and Patroclus show up, and Achilles is super happy that they won the Trojan War and that his son is doing really well. We see Ajax, who's not happy. We also get to see some of the punishments that happen in the underworld. So he sees Tantalus, who is condemned to be stuck he's chest high in a river. But every time he bends down to drink some of the water recedes. But above him is a fruit tree with delicious fruits. But every time he raises his head to eat some of the fruit sort of pulls back up. So he can never get satisfaction. Another person he sees is Sisyphus, who's forever rolling that rock up a hill. To quote Albert Camus, one must imagine Sisyphus happy. We also get to see Heracles, or Hercules in the Latin version, and that's it. At that point, he's like, I've seen too many spirits. We've got to go home. Okay, we're in book 12. We're halfway through, people. They return to the island, Aiaia. They bury Elpenor, who was, still lying there after having fallen off the roof. And Circe is like, I'm going to give you very detailed instructions on how to get home, so you have no more misfortunes, okay? First, you're going to encounter sirens. Make sure everyone covers up their ears. If you're absolutely desperate to hear the siren song, make sure they tie you to a mast. And that's not even your biggest problem. She introduces him to the fact that there's 2 routes for him to get home. One goes through the Wandering Rocks. These are rocks that just slam together. And she's like, not even a bird can get through there. The only people who got through were Jason and the Argonauts, and that's because a goddess was helping them. That is not a route you can take. So instead, you have to go past Scylla and Charybdis. Now, Scylla and Charybdis are 2 monsters. Charybdis is like a giant whirlpool. And 3 times a day, it sort of sucks in water and then spouts water back out. So you do not want to get caught in Charybdis because you're never going to get out. Scylla is therefore your better option, except Scylla has 12 legs, and even worse, she's got 6 necks with 6 mouths, which means you're going to be losing 6 of your people. And Odysseus is like, okay, cool, we can totally do this. I can fight Scylla. And Circe's like, no, You are just a man. This is a monster. You will not be able to fight her. You just have to make it past. You have to make this sacrifice. They head off. They go past the sirens. Odysseus has told his men what to expect, so they've all got their ears closed off, and he gets to hear their song. It goes pretty quickly, considering how famous that scene is. Then they get to the next bit, and Odysseus tells his people about Charybdis, about this giant whirlpool that they're going to avoid. He doesn't tell them about Scylla, and so 6 of his people die. But they've made it through. They're on their way. The one thing they should now not do is what Tiresias warned them about, and that is eat the cattle on the island of the sun god. They float past this island, and his men are like, we're tired. We would like to sleep. Can we just dock here? And it is like, we shouldn't, but they outvote him. And so they do. And of course then, Zeus has this massive storm start. And that storm lasts for a month. And by the end of this month, they're out of food. And Odysseus goes to this little shrine place to pray to the gods to please let them go home. And while he is away, his men kill the cattle on the island of the sun god. Odysseus comes back and he's like, we're doomed. Well, I'm not doomed. I didn't need anything, but y'all are doomed. They head off. Helios, the sun god, is told about this, and he goes to Zeus and he's like, these people have eaten my cows. We cannot let this stand. And Zeus is like, you're absolutely right. We cannot let this stand. So again, Zeus causes a massive storm. All of Odysseus' men die, except for him. And this is how Odysseus washes up on Calypso's island. In Book 13, Odysseus' tale has now been told. And the Phaeacians are like, oh my god, you're amazing. This was so interesting. Great. We're going to help you get home. We're going to give you a boatload of treasure, literally. And so they head off. And Odysseus has fallen asleep, so once they get to Ithaca, the men sort of load him and his treasure off and then just quietly leave. Now remember how Poseidon is still quite mad at Odysseus. He's like, I can't believe these Phaeacians have just helped him. This will not stand. And Zeus is like, of course it will not stand. Do what you have to do. And he turns the returning ship into stone, and then he has part of Phaeacia enclosed in rock. And it's really interesting because I'm like, but they're meant to help guests. But the gods can do what the gods want to do, I guess. Odysseus, meanwhile, awakes on a shore, and he's like, where am I now? What is this godforsaken place? Because he can't recognize anything. Athena sort of caused this mist, so he doesn't know where he is. Athena then appears in the guise of a shepherd, and she actually reveals to him, I think we might be in Ithaca. And Odysseus is like, oh my god, that's so exciting, by the way. And he just starts lying to her about who he is. And Athena is so excited about this, and I have to read you that little bit verbatim. We have Odysseus straight up lying to Athena's face, and she says, to outwit you in all your tricks, a person or a god would need to be an expert at deceit, you clever rascal, so duplicitous, so talented at lying. You love fiction and tricks so deeply you refuse to stop even in your own land. Yes, both of us are smart. No man can plan and talk like you, and I am known among the gods for insight and craftiness. You fail to recognize me. I am Athena, child of Zeus. I always stand near you and take care of you in all your hardships. So she's like, I see you. Game recognizes game. And she reveals Ithaca to him. She takes away the mist. He's absolutely excited. By now she's turned back into a woman as well. And then they get down to business. She's like, you have suitors back home. This is not good. So she changes his appearance once again. Athena changes Odysseus into an old beggar. And then she's like, I'm gonna go get your son. In Book 14, Odysseus is in Ithaca, and he journeys slowly but surely to the homestead of a swineherd called Emmaus. Now, the fun thing is, most of the Odyssey is sort of told in third person. He does this, he does that, he said. And of course, as Odysseus was telling his story, he was like, I said, I did. But here with Eumaeus, the story addresses him in second person. It's like, and you, Eumaeus, you responded, blah, blah, blah. This happens sometimes in the Iliad as well. And I feel like there is importance to that. There's only certain characters who get addressed in second person. But yeah, I just wanted to mention that because it's a fun little aspect of it. Anyway, Odysseus meets Eumaeus, who is a swineherd and a slave that actually belongs to Odysseus, but he's in disguise. And of course, you're never going to believe this, he lies. He pretends to be someone else. And Eumaeus is heartbroken about the fact that his master, Odysseus, is still not here, and he is convinced that Odysseus is dead. And Odysseus in disguise is like, well, maybe you will see him again very soon. Now, in book 15, Athena has run over, or whatever gods do, to Sparta to tell Telemachus it's time to come home. Menelaus gives him loads of gifts, and Athena is like, I know how you can avoid the suitors, because let's not forget, they're plotting to kill you. And before Telemachus heads off, Helen makes a prophecy and guarantees that Odysseus will basically return. Now, before they get onto their ship, they pick up a random stranger called Theoclymenus. He killed someone back home, he got exiled, but you gotta be nice to strangers and guests, so Telemachus is like, yeah, you can come with. Meanwhile, Odysseus is still with the swineherd, Eumaeus, and Eumaeus now gets to tell his tragic tale of woe about how he ended up a slave with Odysseus's family. It's quite sad. Actually, he was kidnapped as a child. But apparently he really enjoys Ithaca. Telemachus comes back home, and wouldn't you know it, instead of going to his mother, he goes to see Eumaeus. Book 16 is where we get our grand reunion between father and son. Telemachus arrives, and he's a bit unsure, and you can really tell, although Telemachus is like 20 years old, he's very insecure in himself. All of the Odyssey is basically an effort on his part to grow up into manhood, to be able to take responsibility, to be confident. But he isn't, so he starts complaining a little bit about the suitors. And Odysseus, in disguise as a beggar, is like, you can't let that stand. Are you just going to, not do anything? He's sort of testing his son a little bit. But Telemachus then sends Eumaeus off to let his mother, Penelope, know that he's returned. And at that point, Odysseus reveals himself to Telemachus, as Athena once again changes his appearance and makes him look super strong and handsome. It's quite a nice reunion. They both cry, and it's very touching. And then, of course, they have to get down to business, and they plot how to best kill the suitors. Apparently there's almost 100, if not more of them. Every time I imagine this, I'm imagining 20 frat boys. But it sounds like it's 100 at least of them, and that's horrifying on multiple fronts. So while they're plotting, Eumaeus visits Penelope, and he's like, your son has returned. And at the same time, those suitors who'd been trying to sort of kill Telemachus as he came back home, they arrive and they're like, yeah, we didn't see him. I don't know where he went. At this point also, Penelope overhears them talking about this, and she confronts them, and she's like, I can't believe you would do this to me in my own home. I mean, you've been annoying as all, but kill my son. And so she confronts the leader of the suitors about it, Antinous. In book 17, Telemachus goes home. He tells his mother Penelope about his journey, the things he learned from Nestor and Menelaus, but he does not tell her that Odysseus has come home, because this is a secret. But that random stranger he picked up, Theoclymenus, he tells Penelope about the various omens they have seen, which will surely mean that Odysseus will come home soon. The suitors organize another feast, they're going to have games, and Odysseus arrives to these as a beggar. There is another herd, I think he's a goat herder, Melanthius, who technically also belongs to Odysseus, but he's super rude to Odysseus disguised as a beggar. He sort of kicks him as Odysseus tries to get to the palace, but he does, and this is where we get a very touching scene that's also quite famous. Outside the gates of his palace there lies an old dog, and this is a dog that is clearly neglected. No one is really looking after it. It's on its last legs, and his name is Argos. And Odysseus knows this because he raised him when he was a puppy. And Argos has been waiting for his master to return. He recognizes Odysseus despite his disguise, and having seen his master a last time, poor Argos dies. And it's quite sad. And Odysseus also wonders why people have been neglecting his dog. But he has a mission to complete. He goes into the palace, he gets heckled and insulted by all of the suitors, especially by Antinous, who's sort of really our main villain here. Eumaeus the swineherd does try and stand up for him. He's like, hey, we're meant to be nice to guests. This isn't even your house. You can't be rude to people in other people's houses. And Penelope overhears this. She also wants to see the stranger. She's like, has this man maybe heard something about my husband? And she makes something of a prediction. She's like, wouldn't it be amazing if Odysseus came home? And at that moment, Telemachus sneezes. And she's like, haha, my son sneezed. That's a sign. It's happening. And that's just very fun. But Odysseus in disguise will not yet go see Penelope. That has to wait for a later date. In book 18, there is a very random scene. I wonder if that'll make it into the film. Another beggar shows up at the palace called Iris, and he's like, I am the beggar who comes to the palace. Who is this new beggar? And so him and Odysseus in disguise have a brawl. Odysseus absolutely kicks his ass. And everyone's like, interesting. And one of the other suitors, Amphinous, he gets a little bit suspicious. He's like, what's going off here? But in that moment, Penelope, inspired by Athena, decides that it's time to tell the suitors what's up and to also remind them of how absolutely beautiful she is. So she goes downstairs and she's like, you're eating me out of house and home. You are the worst. You tried to kill my son. Now you're being rude to my guests. And what am I getting out of this? Nothing. And the suitors are like, okay, yeah, fair. So they give her gifts. And what's really nice is that Odysseus is sitting there in disguise and he's like, my wife is so clever. Look at her getting treasure and gifts out of these men that I will soon be killing. Delightful. Less delightful is the fact that he thinks he has to test the slave women in his house to see which of them have stayed loyal. And there's one slave girl in particular, Melantho, who's been sleeping with another one of the suitors, a very important one, not quite as important as Antinous, but another called Eurymachus. She insults Odysseus. She is not nice to him. And it's difficult to know what to read into that scene because, well, she's an enslaved person. How much of a choice does she really have in her relationship with the suitors, right? Like, Penelope can't even tell these suitors to just leave. So what is this slave girl supposed to do? But yeah, she's also being set up as something of a villain. At this point, Eurymachus also insults Odysseus. He throws a stool at him, and we know that these suitors don't have much time left. Book 19. We are so close to the end, my friends. Odysseus and Athena are hatching plans with Telemachus, and a key piece of this plan is that they need to remove all of the weapons from the hall because they can't have the suitors have access to weapons when it all goes down. Melantho, the slave girl, is once again rude. At this point, Penelope intervenes, and now Odysseus in disguise and Penelope actually have a conversation. And it's a really interesting sort of back and forth where you keep wondering to what extent Penelope knows what's going on. Does she recognize Odysseus despite his disguise? Does she not? You can't really tell. Penelope is I think the word Emily Wilson uses in the introduction is opaque. You can't really tell what she's feeling. We know that she is deeply sad. We know that she's also a deeply intelligent woman. But we can never fully grasp to what extent she is putting the clues together or to what extent she's truly being left in the dark and has no idea what's going on. But she's like, you're a guest in my home. We'll talk later again, but first you should be washed and fed, etc. And Eurycleia turns back up. The slave woman who used to be a nanny to Telemachus and a nanny to Odysseus, she is the one who is called to help clean him. And Odysseus is like, uh-oh, this woman raised me. She is undoubtedly going to recognize me. Because although he's been disguised as a beggar, apparently that is not a full body transformation. So when she washes his feet and legs, she recognizes a scar he has on his leg, which was given to him by a boar in childhood. And so she recognizes him, and Odysseus lets her in on the plan, and he's like, don't tell anyone, especially not Penelope. But now we could actually use your help tomorrow. He has another conversation with Penelope, and we have something of a suggestion where she's like, well, maybe I could organize a contest for the suitors tomorrow and, bring this all to an end. They could perform a feat, maybe, that my husband was always able to do. And Odysseus is like, yeah, great idea. And again, you wonder, how much does she know? We're at book 20. We're in the end phase. Athena visits Odysseus during the night, both to sort of assure him it's going to be fine, we're going to get revenge, but also to sort of make him extra angry. Even though Athena is technically on Odysseus' side, she She's constantly opening him up to insults, making sure that the suitors are extra mean to him just to get that rage going so that he's ready for what's about to come. The house, meanwhile, when morning hits, starts to prepare for another big feast, and Melanthius reappears, that goat herd who's with the suitors instead of with Odysseus, and we have a third and final, I promise, herdsman. I think he's a cow herder, who's called Philoetius. He is also very loyal to Odysseus. So Odysseus has 2 herdsmen on his side, the suitors 1. There is feasting. There's multiple insults against Odysseus. And at a certain point, a prophet who's among them, Theoclymenus, he gets this vision of absolute doom, and they just kick him out. They're like, I don't know what you've been drinking. We're not going to die today. Thank you very much. On that note, book 21 starts. Athena has Penelope get the contest started that she thought of earlier. And she has these axe heads gathered. And so apparently these axe heads have like a little loop, iron loop at the top where it's meant to go into the hilt. And these are just the heads themselves. So they have these loops. And apparently Odysseus also had this really impressive bow. And she's like, whoever can string this bow the way Odysseus did and can get an arrow through all of these axe heads, I think there's 12 of them, that's the man I'm going to marry. They all try. No one manages it. Telemachus even tries to do it, and he's like, turns out I'm still just a boy. When will I be strong like my father? Bless. Telemachus really is trying. But they all give it a go. None of them really manage it, to the point that they're like, well, this is a useless contest if none of us can do it. At this point, Odysseus quickly takes Eumaeus and Philoetius, the 2 herdsmen who are loyal to him, outside. He reveals himself to them, and he's like, I'm going to need your help real soon. I need some of y'all to close the door. I need some of y'all to do this. And then I need you to come back to the hall because it's about to go down. So he goes back inside, and he's like, let me have a try. I know I'm but a poor beggar, and I would never dream of even marrying Penelope, Queen of Ithaca. But I can try, right? Penelope is like, yeah, let him. And Telemachus is like, shut up, Mom. Go upstairs. And you truly have to wonder why Telemachus is being so weird to his mother. But Penelope does leave. She goes upstairs, which is actually for the best, because it truly is about to go down. Telemachus has Eurycleia gather all the women together, close the doors, make sure they're locked away as well, and Odysseus gets that bow and completes the contest like it's nothing. And this book arguably ends on a cliffhanger, because he then turns to the suitors. Da-da-da-da. Book 22. For some reason, Odysseus decides to get naked. He takes off his clothes, draws an arrow, kills Antinous, leader of the suitors, dead. Eurymachus, the second most important suitor, starts begging for his life, and Odysseus is like, no, 'tis I, Odysseus. You've been in my house, you've been rude to my wife, you tried to kill my son. This is the end for you. So the suitors try to get up a defense, right? And this is again where it's important to remember that there's like 100 ? Of them, and there's only Odysseus, Telemachus, Eumaeus, and Philoetius on the other side. It turns into something of a battle. Melanthius is trying to help the suitors by getting them weapons from where Telemachus had stored them away, because Telemachus forgot to close the door. So at that point, the other 2 herds manage to capture him, lock him up somewhere, and the battle is really going. And Athena is like egging them all on, but especially Odysseus. She's like, you can't stand for this in your own home. There are 2 people who are left unscathed. The poet Phemius, who was like, I'm not here to suit. They tell me to sing and I have to sing. And a houseboy called Metre. Telemachus interferes for the latter, and he's like, no, Metre is actually on our side. He's a good one. So those 2 are spared, and the rest of them are dead. They are slaughtered. When the massacre is over, they decide to get Eurycleia back in, have her call all the slaves and servants together, because it's time to clean up. Because actually, all of this is quite bad. Even though the suitors have been annoying, the suitors are also the sons of the most important families in Ithaca and beyond. And Odysseus has just killed all of them. And while he may feel that's reasonable, even Odysseus knows that they're in a bit of a bind now. So they start cleaning up, they start pretending that there is a wedding feast. And another thing that happens, which is also, again, one of those things that's quite complex to think about, is that the slave girls who had affairs, is sort of how it's put, with the suitors are killed. There is an excellent book by Margaret Atwood called The Penelopiad, and that is told from the perspective of these slave girls. And it sort of problematizes this idea of like, well, how much freedom did they really have in that choice? Why should they be killed just so that Odysseus can feel like he's back in charge of his household, right? There's this idea of he needs to purify his home and they are contaminated. So that's quite gross. Book 23, we have the cleanup being completed, and Eurycleia runs upstairs to Penelope and she's like, it's all good. Odysseus has come home. The suitors are dead. You should come downstairs. And she doesn't really believe it. Penelope has been through a lot. She goes downstairs, Penelope, and she starts having a conversation with Odysseus, and they're testing each other. And this is quite a fun moment where you can tell, like, Odysseus is smart, but his wife is just as smart. And she's like, okay, cool, well, if you're my husband, then I'll just have our bed brought downstairs, right? And Odysseus is like, what have you done to my bed? I built our bed out of an olive tree that was growing in our palace. It cannot be moved. I did this to it, I did that to it, but you cannot move my bed. And she's like, oh my God, it is you. You passed the test, yay! And Telemachus is like, Mom, why are you testing my father when he's already been through so many things? And at this point, Odysseus is like, nah, it's fair, actually, that she's doing a bit of testing. And so they have a night of conjugal bliss, and they engage in their second favorite activity as well, which is storytelling. He tells her about everything he's experienced, and I think he probably whitewashes some of it. But most importantly, what gets brought up, sort of in the background, somewhat implicitly, is that although he's back, he's not back for good. Because let's not forget that Tiresias told him in the underworld that he needed to carry an oar around until someone thought it was a winnowing fan. It's weird. With that, we hit the last book, book 24, and this begins with the god Hermes making his final appearance, gathering all of the spirits of the dead suitors, and he brings them to the underworld, and there they get sort of welcomed by Achilles and Patroclus and Ajax and Agamemnon. All the guys are back, and they're like, what happened? Why are we dead? And it's sort of quite a weird note to end on for them. Odysseus, meanwhile, goes to see his father, who he still hasn't seen, and for some reason he decides to try and trick his old father, Laertes, by pretending to be someone else first. Yeah, can't teach an old dog new tricks, apparently. But then he does reveal himself after having tested his dad for some reason. They have a bit of a family meal. Telemachus is also there. Athena once again changes Odysseus' appearance so that he now sort of looks like himself again, except much more attractive. And then the problem that we had with the fact that he's just killed 100 plus young men from Ithaca, their dads are really upset. Especially the dad of Antinous. And he gives a little speech to the other dads where he absolutely reads Odysseus for filth. He's like, we can't trust this man. First, he took off most of our sons to go fight in the Trojan War 20 years ago, and none of them came back. And now he's killed the other ones. So they get a little group together, something of a mob. They go towards Laertes' farm, residence, and conflict is brewing. And Athena's like, oh my God, this is so exciting. And it's sort of quite cute that in like a weird way, Odysseus, his son Telemachus, and his father Laertes, they sort of line up a little bit and they're like, let's do it. And Odysseus is like, don't disappoint me, Telemachus. And Telemachus is like, I would never. And Laertes is like, look at my son and my grandson. This is the best day of my life fighting with you guys. It's weird, but in a cute way. And Athena sort of turns to Laertes and she's like, you were always my favorite, actually. But before any of the violence can really get going, Athena intervenes, tells Odysseus to chill, that it's not the right time to get the gods angry at him again. And that's it. That's where the Odyssey ends. And you have to wonder, can Odysseus settle down? Can he find someone who doesn't know what an oar is, but does know what a winnowing fan is? Is that even a real place where he's meant to go? But it was fun. I had fun with it. I hope you had some fun with it. I hope most of that was also somewhat logical, that you could follow it, at least. It's a good story. There's a lot going on, and what I really like about it is how it's sort of a story within a story. We very much start in media res with Odysseus on the island with Calypso, and we get told all of these big stories that we know, the Cyclops, the Sirens, Scylla and Charybdis. We get told all of that in flashback. And the story is really as much about Telemachus, about him having to grow up and try and take his father's place, only for his father to then come back, right? And a really interesting thing that Emily Wilson mentions in her introduction is that it's unclear how much Telemachus really grows up, how much he's also meant to, because he can't become the man of the house. First, because, he hasn't really tried that out yet, but also because his father then comes back. So he can't be too powerful or too full of authority because he needs to cede it again to his father, right? So that's really interesting. Things I'm excited about to potentially see in the film. So obviously we know that they've cast the gods, so the gods are going to be in there. And that might feel obvious, but there's actually a number of traditions around sort of Homeric epics, especially the Iliad. The Iliad had a number of Latin redactions in the Middle Ages that took the gods out completely, where they were like, okay, the gods are all good fun, but here is what actually happened. And they just take the gods out, right? So I'm glad that the gods are in there. Also because in the Troy film adaptation, which I thought was not good, they took the gods out. So I'm glad the gods are in there because they are fun. The Odyssey does not make sense without Athena in it. I'm so excited to see Athena, and Zendaya is going to be so good at it. I just know that. So I'm looking forward to the gods. I'm also really intrigued to find out if they stick to the narrative, if they start in media res, and if they have that situation of Odysseus explaining his adventures to us, right? And obviously with a film, you can then switch into a flashback and show it to us. But I wonder if they're going to do that or if they're going to try and tell it sort of chronologically, right? I would prefer for them to stick to the in media res and flashback because, yeah, I like that a bit more. I like that it feels just a little bit more intricate, if that makes sense. I also wonder what they're going to do with Calypso. Calypso is played by Charlize Theron, which is excellent when it comes to casting. Calypso is a conflicting figure in many ways because she is this beautiful, immortal goddess/nymph, and yet she's sort of pleading with this mere mortal to please stay with her. So on the one hand, you have that sort of quite sad aspect to it, but she's also been interpreted quite often as this sort of temptress who is keeping this man as basically like a sex slave for her own pleasure, although he wants to leave, right? And that's also not accurate. Like the Odyssey is quite clear that Odysseus is very willing for a number of years to sleep with her and to stay there, right? It's only towards the end that he's like, I would actually like to go home now. So I wonder how they're going to deal with that, how they're going to meld that sort of vulnerability with that strength. What else? I also am curious what they're going to do with Penelope, played by Anne Hathaway. As I mentioned, Penelope is quite a difficult figure to nail down in the Odyssey itself. There are a lot of signs and there are a lot of different ways those signs can be read. So she is smart, she's clever, she's in control of her household, and yet she is constantly in the dark, crying and being told to go back to her room. How you move through that and maybe give power and validity to both sides of that coin, I think that would be quite interesting to see how that works out. I would like for both of it to be there, for her to be able to really sort of mourn and have that sadness and despondency, but to not just be constantly shoved in a corner. That would be nice. I'm also very curious how many suitors they're going to have. If they're going to show all of it, I wonder if they're going to let Matt Damon as Odysseus get naked to kill them all. Gotta stay true to the text. I'm quite curious about Matt Damon as Odysseus as well, to be quite honest. He, to me, it's like he and Ben Affleck were in The Last Duel, which was a film about a medieval duel, the last one. Well, not the last one, but the last properly recorded legal trial one. And both him and Ben Affleck, for me, have, 21st century face. Not because they were born in the 21st century. I appreciate they're also somewhat babies, but they feel modern to me in how they appear. So I'm quite curious to see how that will translate. And I do wonder what they're going to do with Odysseus, if they're going to allow him to be both flawed and heroic in that sort of exorbitant way. Because I think that would be more interesting for our time now as well. I think most of us are quite suspicious of people in leadership roles who establish themselves as leaders, who tell grand tales about their own achievements. I think we tend to be suspicious of that already, and have been for quite a while now as well. So yeah, I would like for there to be an ambiguity to that, for Odysseus to be someone that you can root for in his mission while also side-eyeing a lot of the things he does in order to get there. Because he is constantly lying and tricking and deceiving, and it's not always necessary. But it is an integral part of his personality to lie and to deceive and to come up with schemes instead of being straightforward, right? If you took all of that out, it would no longer be Odysseus. It's just like if you took the pride and anger out of Achilles, that would not be Achilles. Achilles needs to be a slightly twisted, angry little boy inside of a sort of very strong man, right? Like he needs to throw a temper tantrum. He needs to be proud, too proud for his own good, for it to be Achilles. And similarly, Odysseus needs to be a trickster. And I think that would be the only thing that could upset me with the film, if they smooth that out too much. Yeah, I think, God, I'm looking at it. I've just passed 1.5 hours in recording, so I should probably stop this and end it there. Let me know if you have any thoughts about the Odyssey, if there's anything about the plot that you still got questions about. And yeah, that's it for today. If you have questions, thoughts on the book, or recommendations or requests for future episodes, feel free to leave a comment or send me an email at bookcentralpod@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. You can also subscribe to be informed when new episodes drop. You can find references to the materials used today in the description. Book Central is written and produced by me, and our music is by Scott Buckley. Thank you for joining me today on the International Express to Book Central.